Welcome back. We have day 73 today, Deuteronomy chapters 25 to 27 and Galatians chapter 5. Deuteronomy continues with a list of rules and regulations, a list of God's hopes and plans for the way we live and interact together in the world. And one of the chapters, once again, is talking about tithing. Now, no one wants to hear pastors talking about money. It's one of the big things that causes people to leave churches. Pastor talks too much about money. But I'm going to talk about money again here because, first of all, we're reading through the Bible and it's in the Bible. I want to point out just how often we are coming across verses that have to do with economics and that God has God's own plan for economics. And God's idea of economics is often very different from the economics of the time or of the economics of our day today. God, as we're going through the Old Testament, you can see God talks about economics a lot. How we treat our slaves, what we do with our harvests, what we give in offerings, how we take care of widows and orphans. Now, one of the things is why are widows and orphans talked about so much? In this time period, everyone is part of family groups based on blood and marriage. So anyone that is born to your family, you have an obligation to care for them. There is no Social Security, there's no Medicaid, there's no social safety net, there's no government running things to catch people when they fall through the cracks. So families, you marry into a family, you're born into a family, that's the group of people who have the job of taking care of you. Widows and orphans are a special case because orphans, by definition, have no family. Their parents have died. Widows are in the same situation. Their husbands have died. They have no marriage relationship caring for them. Now, that's why some of Deuteronomy has some verses about how brothers are supposed to marry the widows of their brothers who have passed away. And there's some details about how to take care of that. But sometimes there's situations where the whole family's gone. So widows and orphans are in a situation where they have no blood relatives to care for them, which means they have no one to care for them. Because of the economics at the time, there is no way for them to go get a job, to earn money, to support themselves. There's nowhere to live. Everyone's living arrangements is in houses or in tents based on family units. So widows and orphans have no way to feed themselves, to earn money, to care for themselves, to have a place to live if others don't care for them. So that's why God is frequently listing widows and orphans as needing special care and concern as you go through the Bible. What does that have to do with us today? This is something my husband and I wrestled with at one point in our lives in our 30s when we were doing Bible studies, and we felt called to actually adopt a foster child because we sat down to try to figure out who are the most invisible people, the most isolated, marginalized people in our country today. And we decided it was older foster kids between the ages of 5 and 18. They almost never find families to be adopted, and they live a really rough, isolated, marginalized life. So that was the reason that we decided to become foster parents and adopted a child from the foster system into our family. We don't have to do things quite that drastic. That is a really, really major sacrifice for a family to make. But when you can be part of Big Brothers and Big Sisters, you can be part of a scout troop volunteering, you can work at a school as a volunteer, you can help shelters for families in your communities. There's a lot of different ways that we can make sure we give our time and our money to the widows and orphans, the invisible people in our society today who are having a really rough time. Another group of people that I think would fall in this category right now are people who've been incarcerated and have done their time and have been released. There are a number of companies that refuse to hire them. There are a number of landlords who refuse to rent to them, and they have a really difficult time coming out of prison and trying to reintegrate into society successfully. So these are some groups of people that I think fall in the same category as widows and orphans in the Old Testament, that God is probably challenging us to look around and figure out ways that we can support them today. Now, one other cultural thing I'd like to just explain here is in this section of Deuteronomy, it talks about first fruits. And this has come up a few times, and it's going to be coming up in Joshua in a little bit. But first fruits is the idea that you give to God the first of your harvest. Now, by the time you're harvesting, you're probably running out of food from the previous harvest. And so a lot of people feel pretty desperate and they want to celebrate and they want to enjoy the first foods that they harvest every year. And God's like, no, your first fruits come to God as a way that we show trust that God's going to provide the rest of it. So later on in Joshua, we're going to hear about the walls of Jericho coming tumbling down, and the Israelites move into Jericho, but God says, you don't get this city. This city is to remain empty. As a reminder, this is the first city I gave you, and you're going to give it to me. Anyone who does anything here is going to be cursed. And of course, someone does something and they get cursed. But it was a way of showing to God that we trust that God's going to come through on the rest of the plan. So anytime you hear about first fruits, think about, are you giving the first and the best to God, or are you giving the last and the leftovers? This is something that I see play out in church as we walk around a church building and we see the leftovers from people upgrading stuff at home. We get a new piano, we send the old one to church. We get a new couch, we send the old one to church. We're cleaning out Aunt Bessie's house after she passes away. We give a bunch of the leftover stuff that no one wants to buy and leave it at church. There have been a bunch of churches that have actually had a major problem with this. I know of one church that their youth room was full of 8 mismatched couches that had all been taken out of people's homes when they had upgraded homes. So this is not the first fruits to church. This is the leftovers, the used up stuff going to church. And I think we have to think through what we're giving for God's work at church as compared to what we are keeping for ourselves. Chapter 27 talks about putting up a standing stone. Again, this is a cultural thing. King Hammurabi puts up a stone, and we have a copy of one of these where he had carved into the stone all of the laws of his kingdom so that not everyone could read it, but everyone knew there were laws, and you could go get someone who could read it and go look at the stone and find out what the laws of the area are. God here is giving his own specifications of how to set up these stones. But it is a way to remind people of who's in charge, which is God, and what God's plans and regulations are for living together as a community. One other interesting thing in chapter 27 is that God specifies using uncut stones for setting up altars for worship. And I really wonder when I read this if this is, again, a bit of a comeback to the very fancy temples and the highly carved and highly the artisans who work so well and so beautifully on the temples in Egypt. And God's like, the idea here is not to have the biggest, fanciest, most expensive temple altar worship space on the planet. The idea is to have something simple and to spend time with God and not spend a whole bunch of time carving a delicate altar. So I think for us today, it's good to remember that God's not always looking for the fanciest stuff, but instead God wants our hearts and our obedience. As we look at Galatians chapter 5, we are called to live a free life in Jesus. And Paul reminds us that our faith is best expressed in love, not through the implication of the law and legal requirements on everyone around us. Our freedom is to be used to love others, not pursue comfort and our own selfishness. And God is going to give us lots of gifts when we live his way. We get peace and serenity, joy and compassion. One of the benefits Jesus has for us when we live in a life of faith is that he kills off our habits of acting for our own good. I think the real challenge here is trying to figure out what this means for our lives today. What does it look like to live a life of freedom in Jesus? What does it look like to live a life of faith shown in love? I think each of us could think through, what are we doing at work that has more to do with love and less to do with law? What are we doing at home? What are we doing in our community? I think this is really where the rubber meets the road. And it's going to be different for each one of us. Each one of us has different spiritual gifts. Each one of us has different workplaces. Each one of us has different home lives. I was just talking to someone who works at a construction site, and they know that there is a lot of suicide risk for older men. And so they have trained some of the workers. And if someone is having some emotional and mental struggles at work, they know that they can go and chat with these people and get some of the support that they need. That is a very different way of reaching out and supporting your neighbors than what a stay-at-home mom might be doing, raising toddlers at home. But every one of us can find a way that we can show love through Jesus to the people around us. So accept the challenge today and see what you can find as a way to show more love to the people around you because of the freedom Christ has given you. Have fun with that. See you next time.